Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Ready to explore some uncharted territory with me today?
Always up for an adventure. Let's dive in.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Today we're tackling a topic that's been generating a lot of buzz lately: global regulations surrounding cannabis and psychedelics.
Oh, yeah, this is a big one. And it can definitely feel like navigating a maze, especially with all the different perspectives and approaches out there.
Exactly. We'll try to break it down, make it a little less intimidating. We'll be looking at how the US FDA approaches these therapies compared to, say, Canada, the EU, get a global view.
Sounds good. I think it's also important to highlight how these therapies are kind of pushing the boundaries, not just in treatment, but in how medicines are regulated globally. We're seeing some really interesting shifts in thinking.
Absolutely. And speaking of global approaches, those ICH guidelines play a key role in harmonizing how we evaluate these therapies across different countries. But first, let's zoom in on the US FDA. They're often seen as setting the bar for pharmaceutical regulations.
Right. And, even though it's still in draft form, their guidance from December 2017 on formal meetings between the FDA and sponsors gives us some valuable clues about their stance on psychedelic drug development.
So even a draft document can offer insights.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Think of it like peeking behind the curtain. And it gets even more intriguing when you consider how the FDA might classify these investigational products.
How so?
Well, there's a chance they could classify them as botanicals. Remember their guidance on botanical drug development from December 2016?
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
Sure. Basically, it outlines how the FDA approaches products derived from plants. So if we're talking about, say, psilocybin from magic mushrooms, it could potentially fall under this classification.
Wow, so that could lead to a whole new regulatory pathway.
Potentially, yeah. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about those ICH guidelines, specifically ICH M7.
Okay, remind me, ICH stands for?
International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use.
Quite a mouthful, right? I'll say. So what does this M7 guideline focus on?
It's all about mutagenic impurities.
Yeah.
Substances that can mess with DNA and potentially lead to cancer. It helps ensure that new drugs, regardless of their source, don't carry an unacceptable risk.
Makes sense. But I'm curious, does that apply to all carcinogens? Because aren't some substances known to cause cancer but don't necessarily directly impact DNA?
That's a great question, and it highlights a really important point. The guidelines actually state that not every carcinogen needs to be controlled under ICH M7. There's a specific Q&A document addressing this.
Interesting. So which carcinogens fall under this guideline then?
It's specifically those that are mutagenic, meaning they can directly interact with and damage DNA. Non-mutagenic carcinogens, those that cause cancer through other mechanisms, might be covered under different guidelines like ICH Q3A or Q3B.
So it's about understanding the specific way a substance might pose a risk. That seems pretty complex.
Absolutely. For example, research on simple alkyl nitrosamines has shown that their mutagenic potency actually decreases when the total number of carbons in their alkyl substituents exceeds 12 to 14.
Okay, you lost me there. Can you explain that in simpler terms?
Essentially, the size of the molecule can impact its ability to cause mutations. Longer chains seem to be less likely to directly damage DNA, but it's not that straightforward. We also see carcinogenicity in some of these larger molecules, suggesting other mechanisms might be involved.
So size isn't the only factor. There's more to the story.
Right. And it really underscores the need for a comprehensive approach to safety assessment. Now, before we move on to regulations in other parts of the world, there's one more ICH guideline I want to touch on, ICH Q2, R2.
Okay, bring it on. What's this one all about?
It focuses on analytical procedures, specifically ensuring the accuracy and precision of the methods used in pharmaceutical quality control. Sounds a bit technical, but it's super important.
I can see how that would be essential. Essentially making sure the data we're relying on is solid.
Exactly. It's like establishing a common language for quality. Whether data is being submitted to the FDA, Health Canada, or the European Medicines Agency, there's consistency.
That sounds crucial for global harmonization efforts. Now, are we ready to venture beyond U.S. borders and explore how other countries are approaching cannabis and psychedelic regulations?
Ready when you are. Let's see what's happening on the global stage. It's fascinating how different countries approach these therapies based on, well, their own history and culture, right?
Yeah, it's like what's seen as progressive in one place might be considered way too cautious in another.
Exactly. And that historical baggage can really impact how regulations unfold. Like, think about Canada. They were way ahead of the US when it came to medical cannabis, but they're still taking a pretty cautious approach with psychedelics.
So they're kind of dipping their toes in the water, making sure they're comfortable before going all in.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. It's a measured approach. And then you have the EU, which is like a whole other story. It's almost like a patchwork of
In
regulation.
what way?
Well, you have some countries that are actively exploring the potential of these therapies, while others are still, hesitant.
Mhm.
So it's not a unified front like you might see in other regions.
That sounds like a real challenge for anyone trying to, develop or research these therapies on a larger scale.
It definitely adds complexity. But this is where those ICH guidelines really come into play. They provide that common ground, those shared standards that help bridge the gaps between different regulatory systems.
So even though countries might have different perspectives, those guidelines create a framework everyone can work with.
Exactly. It's about harmonizing data, ensuring clinical trials meet certain criteria, and
Yeah.
promoting consistent ways of assessing safety and quality. It helps build confidence between countries.
And that's going to be crucial as these therapies gain more and more attention globally. I mean, we're seeing a real shift in thinking, right?
Oh, absolutely. More and more countries are realizing that the traditional approaches to mental health and pain management aren't always effective. So they're open to exploring alternatives.
Right, it's like the world is waking up to the potential here. But it's not just about changing laws, it's about changing perceptions too, isn't it?
100%. Education is so important. The more people understand the science, the benefits, and of course the risks, the more likely we are to see these therapies integrated into mainstream healthcare.
That makes me think about the role of real-world data in all of this.
Hmm.
We have all this data from clinical trials, which is essential, but then you also have all this information from people using these therapies in their everyday lives. It's like two separate streams of knowledge.
And both are valuable. There's a growing interest in using real-world data to complement what we learn from clinical trials. It can offer insights into how these therapies are actually being used, the long-term effects, things like that.
But it also sounds like there are some challenges there too. I mean, how do we make sure real-world data is collected ethically and analyzed in a way that's meaningful?
That's the million-dollar question. It requires a collaborative effort. We need clinicians, researchers, data scientists, ethicists, and really importantly, input from the people who are actually using these therapies.
It's about combining that rigorous scientific approach with the real-life experiences of people. It feels like that could lead to a much richer understanding.
Exactly. By bringing those worlds together, we can inform regulatory decisions, refine clinical practice, and ultimately improve patient care.
It's like piecing together a puzzle, right?
Yeah.
Getting a clearer picture from multiple perspectives. Speaking of perspectives, something I was thinking about as we prepped for this deep dive was the whole idea of disruptive change in the pharmaceutical industry. Where do cannabis and psychedelics fit into that?
Oh, that's a great question. We're seeing this explosion of innovation, new technologies, new therapies. But at the same time, there's this pressure to keep healthcare costs down,
Yeah.
make treatment accessible. It's a bit of a paradox.
Right. It's like you want to encourage innovation, but you also want to make sure these treatments are available to those who need them.
Absolutely. And companies working on cannabis and psychedelics are right in the middle of that. They have to be innovative, develop high-quality products, and do it all while being mindful of costs.
Because if these therapies are priced out of reach, it defeats the purpose, right?
Yeah.
They need to be accessible.
Exactly. It's a balancing act, and it requires some creative solutions, and the global regulatory landscape plays a huge role in how all this plays out.
It seems like it's a really dynamic time to be involved in this field, both for the people developing these therapies and for those of us just watching it all unfold.
Definitely. There's so much happening, so much potential. It's going to be fascinating to see how the regulatory landscape adapts to keep pace.
I have a feeling we're just scratching the surface here, and I'm excited to see what the future holds. So we've delved pretty deep into these global regulations for cannabis and psychedelics, but let's zoom out a bit now. What does all this mean for someone who's just, interested in this stuff, like maybe as a patient or an investor, or even just someone who's curious?
Well, I think the big takeaway is that we're at a really pivotal point. This growing interest in cannabis and psychedelics, it's really shaking things up.
Yeah, it's challenging those old ways of thinking about medicine, pushing the boundaries of what we thought was possible. And that creates a ton of opportunities.
Absolutely. But like anything new, you got to approach it with, careful consideration. Do your research, ask questions, and demand transparency.
Exactly. Knowledge is key. The more informed we are as individuals, the better equipped we'll be to navigate this evolving landscape and, well, shape the future of healthcare. Right.
And that brings me to something I've been thinking about. As research in these areas keeps growing and interest continues to build, what do you think global regulations should look like? How do we find that balance between giving patients access to potentially life-changing therapies while also ensuring safety and responsible development?
It's a big question, and it's one we all need to grapple with. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive for today. But the conversation definitely doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those tough questions.
Well said.
Until next time, keep diving.